She scrubbed their floors. They laughed behind her back, until the day she took the stage at graduation, revealed who she really was, and shattered everything they thought they knew. This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. They said her name like it didn't matter. Miss Bennett, can you grab the second floor wing before the tour arrives? Miss Bennett, the trash bins in the science lab are overflowing again. Miss Bennett, please don't block the hall with your cart during break. No one ever asked Ruth Bennett how she was doing. No one asked if she had eaten that day, or what she was reading when they caught glimpses of a thick paperback tucked beneath the supply checklist on her janitor cart. They never wondered what she was writing in that weathered, leather-bound notebook, pages so full they curled at the edges. Because in the eyes of most who walked the marble floors of Wellington Heights Academy, Ruth Bennett didn't carry stories. She carried a mop. But what they didn't know, what they never cared to see, was that Ruth had once written curriculum that shaped entire districts, mentored new teachers, and stood in front of packed auditoriums delivering speeches about access, equity, and dignity. That was before everything collapsed, before grief hollowed her into a silhouette of the woman she used to be, before she chose silence over visibility, anonymity over ambition. And it was before she walked into Wellington Heights with a janitor badge clipped to her collar and a plan stitched tightly behind her quiet eyes. At a school where students flew to Aspen for the weekend and celebrated birthdays on yachts docked in Sausalito, Ruth Bennett was invisible. And that's exactly how she needed it to be. She arrived every morning before dawn, often while the fog still wrapped the San Francisco hills in a silver haze. No one saw her enter, and most didn't notice when she left. Her presence was a suggestion, a fleeting shadow in the periphery. And yet, she saw everything. Wellington Heights Academy was a temple of prestige. The stained glass windows in the chapel told stories of legacy, founders, donors, names etched into the stone. The Devereaux Family Language Center, the Langford Innovation Pavilion. And in those halls walked the next generation of leadership, or so they called themselves. Teenagers with last names that appeared in headlines and IPO filings. Girls with manicured nails and diamond initials. Boys who wore Rolexes before their driver's permits. It was a world curated for optics and exclusivity, where charm was currency and kindness was optional. Charlotte Devereaux and Madison Langford were the crown bearers of this empire. Blonde, beautiful, bred for boardrooms and press photos. They had perfected the art of cruelty wrapped in smiles, too practiced, too polished to be punished. They didn't scream or shove. No, their power came in whispers, in eye rolls, in giggles that cut sharper than knives. To them, Ruth was background noise, unimportant, unremarkable, unnoticed. Except that Ruth noticed everything. She noticed how Charlotte's voice dropped half an octave when talking to male faculty, how Madison always made sure to comment on another girl's outfit with a compliment that was secretly an insult. She saw how students of color hesitated before speaking up in class, how they scanned the room for allies before offering opinions. She watched the hallway dynamics, the shifting silences, the hallway graffiti that was wiped away too quickly before visitors arrived. And she took notes. Always notes. They were hidden in plain sight, disguised as floor logs, cleaning schedules, supply orders. But the details were precise. Time-stamped comments, facial expressions, teacher reactions, or lack thereof. Ruth wasn't just mopping floors. She was gathering evidence, documenting culture, building a case. But no one suspected her, because no one believed she could be more than what she appeared, not even the girls who mocked her daily. "Look," Madison once whispered to Charlotte as Ruth passed by their table in the quad, "Professor Pinesall is probably working on her dissertation in dustology." Charlotte smirked. "She's got that honors degree in bleach." Their laughter was louder than necessary, designed to draw attention, to remind everyone watching of the social hierarchy. And it worked. Other students laughed along or looked away. No one stopped them. No one ever did. Ruth kept walking, as always. But that silence? It wasn't submission, it was strategy. She had learned long ago that silence unsettled people more than shouting. It held a mirror to their cruelty. When you didn't flinch, when you didn't react, you forced them to confront themselves. So she didn't give them the satisfaction. Not once. There was only one person at Wellington Heights who ever saw beyond the uniform. Mr. Bennett Collins. Ironic, they shared a name, was the AP literature teacher with untamed hair and a habit of quoting Baldwin mid-lecture. He once caught Ruth carefully straightening copies of To Kill a Mockingbird outside his classroom and raised an eyebrow. Most people just toss those into a bin, he said. Ruth offered a shrug. Some stories deserve better. He smiled. You've read it? Twice, she replied softly. Once when I was young, once when I was old enough to understand it. After that day, every other Friday, he began leaving a book for her on the bench outside the staff room. No notes, no assumptions, just offerings. Sula, The Fire Next Time. Educated. She never said thank you. He never asked why. But they both understood what it meant to recognize someone quietly. That trust kept her going. That and the other life no one at Wellington Heights had ever seen. Every night after the students were gone and the noise of adolescent arrogance faded into shadows, Ruth changed into a clean shirt, unlocked her cart, and pulled out her 6-year-old Dell laptop with the missing N key. She slipped into room 203, a disused classroom at the far end of the north wing. The light flickered. The desk wobbled. But it was hers. There, under flickering fluorescence, she logged into her course portal. She read, typed, revised. She was 2 assignments away from completing her degree in educational leadership, an accelerated adult program offered through a partnership with the University of California. Most staff didn't even know the scholarship clause existed. Buried deep in the employee handbook, it stated that any full-time employee working more than 30 hours a week was eligible for free tuition at partner institutions. Most janitorial staff didn't look beyond the cleaning schedule. Ruth had read the entire manual, twice. But her goal wasn't ambition, it was redemption. Years ago, before the accident, before her world fractured, Ruth had been director of curriculum development for the Orleans Parish School District. She had a corner office, a team, a daughter, a husband, a future. Then came the snowstorm. Her husband's car, crushed beneath a delivery truck. Her daughter Alyssa, hospitalized for months. Surgeries, bills, a diagnosis they couldn't afford to fight. Pneumonia took what the doctors hadn't. Ruth stopped speaking for nearly a year after the funeral. Her home was sold. Her career vanished. She drifted, worked odd jobs, lived in borrowed rooms. Until she saw the notice. The university was launching an equity initiative. They needed researchers, observers, people with lived experience, and the school they were most concerned about? Wellington Heights. Would she be willing to go in quietly? Not as a consultant, not as a scholar, but as a janitor? Ruth didn't hesitate. Because what had failed her daughter, what had stolen her future, was not just illness or accident. It was a system that rewarded wealth over worth, legacy over love, and if she could tear even one corner of that system wide open, she would. So she took the job, wore the uniform, swallowed her pride, and began watching. And for 2 years she watched everyone, especially the girls who laughed at her. Charlotte and Madison thought they were mocking a woman beneath them. They had no idea they were mocking a woman standing on higher ground than they'd ever imagined. They didn't know that every cruel comment was logged, every incident matched with time, location, witnesses. They didn't know that Ruth's observations were being read monthly by members of the university's board of trustees. And they certainly didn't know that in 3 weeks, at graduation, everything would change. Because Ruth Bennett wasn't just about to graduate, she was about to speak. And when she did, the world of Wellington Heights Academy would never look the same again. The rumors started like most things at Wellington Heights Academy, with a whisper and a sideways glance. "She was in the chemistry lab late last night," said Madison Langford, her voice just low enough to sound concerned, but loud enough to be overheard. Charlotte Devereaux arched a brow. "The janitor?" Madison nodded, peeling a sliver of gold foil from the edge of her protein bar. "Sitting at a desk, typing. I think she was using one of the teacher's laptops." They stood beneath the arch leading into the East Garden, where juniors and seniors often lingered between classes. The place was supposed to be peaceful, zen even, with its koi pond and bamboo path, but there was nothing peaceful about the way stories twisted here. The garden was where reputations rose and fell, carried on the soft breeze of gossip disguised as curiosity. Within an hour, the story had shape. Ruth Bennett had been caught using school resources after hours. By lunch, it had grown teeth. She had been snooping through academic files. No one questioned the logic. No one needed evidence. At Wellington Heights, perception often outranked truth. Ruth knew the walls had ears. She could feel it. Something had shifted in the way students passed her in the hallways. There was hesitation now, a pause before they moved aside, as if reassessing her presence. It wasn't the usual blend of disregard and entitlement. It was worse, suspicion. The air felt colder. That afternoon, Ruth was summoned to the operations office. The request had come down as routine, but everyone in the staff lounge knew better. Nothing about administration was ever routine this close to graduation. She walked in with her usual calm, wearing her standard issue Navy uniform, her ID badge pinned just above her heart. Behind the desk sat Mr. Carlyle, the facilities manager, a man who always looked slightly too small for his leather chair. He didn't meet her gaze right away. Instead, he flipped through a clipboard with unnecessary attention. "Miss Bennett," he said finally, "we've received some concerns about your presence in certain areas of the school after hours." She didn't respond. He shifted in his seat. "Have you been spending time in classrooms that are not part of your cleaning rotation?" "I clean what I'm assigned," she said plainly. "Sometimes I finish early. If I have a break, I take it in the nearest available space." "And are you using any of the school's computers during that time?" She held his gaze. "I bring my own." Carlyle nodded, scribbled something onto a form that didn't really matter, and cleared his throat. "No accusations," he muttered. "Just protocol." Ruth stood. "If there's ever a concern about my performance, I'd appreciate a direct conversation, not speculation." His ears flushed pink. She walked out of the office with her shoulders back and her pace measured. But as she stepped into the hallway, she saw Charlotte leaning against the lockers, her phone in hand, thumbs idle, gaze lifted in mock innocence. "Everything all right, Miss Bennett?" she said, sugarcoating the name with performative politeness. Ruth didn't blink. "Better than you'd think." For the first time in months, Charlotte didn't have a comeback. That evening, the school emptied under a sherbet sunset. The seniors lingered in the courtyard, their voices high with anticipation, final exams, graduation rehearsals, college decisions. But for Ruth, the hallway lights dimming always signaled something else: freedom. She slipped into room 203 and locked the door behind her, even though she knew the lock didn't work. It never had. The hinge still squeaked when the wind pressed against it, and the left window rattled when the air conditioning clicked on. But it was home. She opened her laptop and typed in her student credentials. She had an hour to finish her capstone draft, a project she'd been building for nearly a year. redesigning equity practices in independent private schools. The language was clinical, academic, safe. But Ruth knew the heart of it was sharper than anything in the school's student handbook. She had been collecting patterns for months: how faculty responded to student misconduct, who was reprimanded, who was ignored. She logged disciplinary reports, speech patterns in assemblies, scholarship awards, exclusion tactics disguised as policy. Everything had data, everything had intent. And yet, when she sat there alone, she didn't feel powerful. She felt exhausted. She stared at the screen, the cursor blinking. Outside the cracked window, the sky had deepened to navy, stars winking awake. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her sister in Oakland. "You sleeping or still saving the world?" Ruth smiled despite herself. She snapped a picture of her textbook and replied, "Chapter 9 is dragging me by the edges. Send help." A laughing emoji bounced back, followed by, "You're still the smartest person I know. Don't let those rich kids get under your skin." But she didn't text back what she really wanted to say. She didn't mention that Madison had knocked over a mop bucket that morning, then laughed as Ruth knelt down to clean it. Or how Charlotte had loudly told a group of parents on a school tour that the academy loved hiring people with tragic backstories. She didn't mention the ache in her knees that never quite went away, or the heaviness she carried at the end of each shift, not from the labor, but from the knowledge, the knowing, the endless watching. No, Ruth didn't talk about that part. Instead, she closed her eyes and pictured her daughter Alyssa's handwriting, looping letters in pink gel pen, the way she signed every school worksheet with a heart over the I in her name. She remembered Alyssa sitting at the kitchen table, building science fair volcanoes, making Ruth taste cookie batter before baking. Alyssa would have turned 16 this spring. She would have been the one applying to colleges, stressing over finals, picking out a graduation dress. She might have attended a school like Wellington Heights, if the world had been fair. Ruth opened her notebook, flipped past pages filled with faculty transcripts and behavioral analyses, and stopped at a page with a small yellow sticky note. Written in her daughter's handwriting, rescued from the last birthday card she'd ever received, were the words, "You make everything better." She kept that note like a compass, because the truth was, Ruth wasn't in this for a title. She wasn't doing this to prove something to the Charlottes and Madisons of the world. She didn't need their approval. She wanted their illusion shattered. She wanted them to see what they had ignored. Mr. Collins passed her in the hallway the next morning. "You doing okay?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded. "You've been here long enough to know the games these kids play." "I've been here long enough," she agreed. He paused. "Is there anything I can do?" "Keep doing what you're doing," she said. "That's rare enough." He nodded and walked away, but she saw the way his hands tightened around the copy of Beloved in his arms. Something was shifting. It wasn't just her. Later that week, an anonymous excerpt from a blog post started making rounds among faculty, an essay that discussed social privilege and hidden labor in elite educational environments. It used coded language, but anyone who paid attention could sense the setting. Charlotte overheard two teachers discussing it in the lounge and narrowed her eyes. "People are so dramatic," she said, "acting like we're running a cult of privilege or something." Madison laughed. "If they want more scholarship kids, they can start their own school." But their laughter didn't ring the same. The energy had changed. There were pauses now. People were thinking. And Ruth? She was almost done with her final paper. She had submitted a list of recommendations to her professor, not knowing they'd soon be shared far beyond her class. Her notes included ideas for more inclusive discipline, revised curriculum audits, student leadership reforms, and a redefinition of what it meant to belong. It wasn't theory. It was what Wellington Heights needed to become if it wanted to survive. Because students like Charlotte and Madison were not anomalies. They were products of legacy, of unchecked admiration, of a system built to protect certain names more than it nurtured growth. Ruth wasn't angry at them. Not anymore. She was ready to outgrow them. On a Friday night, long after everyone else had left, she stayed in room 203 just a little longer. She reread her essays. She rewatched one of the video lectures she had downloaded months earlier, an interview with a black woman who had been the first to chair a school board in her state. The woman said, "True authority isn't loud. It doesn't chase power. It observes. It waits. And when the time comes, it moves." Ruth paused the video. She opened her journal. She wrote the quote in bold ink. Then she underlined it twice. She looked out the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, the Golden Gate Bridge barely visible through the low fog. And just beyond that fog, change was coming. Soon she wouldn't just be the quiet one in the hallway. She would be the one standing at the front of the room. And this time, no one would be able to look away. It began, as most revelations do, with a sentence not meant to be heard. Ruth Bennett was cleaning the faculty lounge, moving slowly so as not to make noise. The room was warm with the scent of old coffee and lemon disinfectant. Chairs were tucked in precisely, except for one slightly pulled back, just enough to suggest someone had been sitting there, maybe forgot their phone, maybe meant to return. She reached for a damp rag to wipe down the table when she heard the voices from the adjoining hallway. "She's not even really staff," said Charlotte Devereaux's voice, sharp and unfiltered. "She's what's the word my mom uses? Oh, optics." There was laughter. "She told me it makes us look like we care," Madison Langford added. "My dad said the school's bleeding money on these scholarship incentives for people like her. It's basically charity." Charlotte scoffed. "Can't fix broke. Not with books." Ruth didn't move. Her hand was frozen mid-wipe, palm pressed flat against the cool surface of the table. The rag sagged from her fingers like something drained of use. She didn't step forward, didn't gasp, didn't slam the door open or storm into the hallway. She simply stood there, body still, eyes closed. She had been patient. She had been disciplined. She had cataloged every smirk, every slight, every passive-aggressive smile wrapped in privilege. But this was different. This wasn't just cruelty. It was confirmation. The thing she had always known, deep beneath the surface, was now spoken aloud. They believed her presence was a prop. They thought her existence was a tool for their image. And they didn't fear consequences because they had never seen them. But Ruth was tired of watching, tired of absorbing, tired of pretending the weight didn't press harder each day. That night, she returned to room 203 without changing clothes. Her uniform still smelled faintly of bleach and lavender. She opened her laptop, the screen glowing pale against the dark. A new document, a new heading. Final report. She'd been building it slowly for over a year, cross-referencing names and times, aligning her notes with camera blind spots, staff behaviors, policy loopholes. But now, it took shape with new urgency. The first paragraph was clear. Based on extended in-person observation over 22 months, there exists a measurable pattern of normalized class-based discrimination, peer-to-peer psychological aggression, and institutional neglect in the enforcement of equitable student standards at Wellington Heights Academy. She didn't stop typing until the battery warning flashed red. Even then, she sat in the dark a little longer, the outline of her reflection faint in the glass of the computer screen. It was the first time in years she'd allowed herself to feel the fire rather than just manage it. 12 years earlier, Ruth Simmons, before she had reverted to her maiden name Bennett, had lived a life of warm structure. She'd overseen curriculum development for the largest public school district in Louisiana. She had a staff of 5, a corner office, a plaque from the state superintendent on her wall. She had a daughter, Alyssa, whose laugh filled their kitchen, and a husband who built birdhouses in the garage on weekends. Then winter came. The car crash happened during a snowstorm on I-10, a delivery truck losing control and slamming into her husband's sedan. He was killed instantly. Alyssa was barely pulled from the wreckage, her tiny frame battered and limp. She survived, but the months that followed felt like death in slow motion. Machines beeping, tubes humming, hospital room lights that never turned off. She sold her retirement, took out a second mortgage, left her job on medical leave that became permanent, and when pneumonia swept in like a thief in the night, taking Alyssa while Ruth sat holding her hand, everything else unraveled in silence. She moved through grief like fog, thick and shapeless. For a year, she drifted between cities, between jobs that required no eye contact and offered no permanence. Cleaning houses, stocking shelves, sleeping on friends' couches. Her degrees, framed and dusty, stayed in a cardboard box. Then came the email. A colleague from her education days, now working at a university in California, reached out. The message was short and cryptic. I don't know where you are, but we have a problem we can't solve from inside. Are you willing to step back into the fire? Not as who you were, but as someone no one would expect. Attached was a confidential proposal, an equity pilot designed to monitor and document class dynamics within elite private institutions. The university had partnered with several schools across the state, offering full tuition and board oversight to any staff willing to go undercover. But the role required more than credentials. It required someone willing to be invisible again. Ruth replied that night with one word: yes. Within a month, she was hired at Wellington Heights as janitorial staff. Her background was clean, her references checked out. She used her maiden name. She declined benefits. No one asked questions. She was never there to clean. She was there to see. And now, she'd seen enough. The day after she submitted her final report to the board's internal compliance director, the atmosphere on campus began to shift. She didn't know what had been triggered: an email, a quiet inquiry, a confidential meeting, but something had landed. Students were suddenly cautious. Charlotte and Madison still performed their daily drama, but their cruelty had turned brittle, more theatrical than piercing. The laughter that once followed them like perfume now fell short. Their circle had grown thinner. One morning, Madison dropped a silver necklace outside the janitor's closet. Ruth noticed it immediately but said nothing. 30 minutes later, a commotion erupted near the lockers. "It's gone!" Madison cried, eyes wide. "It was in my locker this morning, I swear." Charlotte leaned in dramatically. "Maybe check the mop bucket." A few students chuckled, an automatic response, but others looked uncomfortable. An admin assistant overheard and offered to investigate. Suddenly, Madison backpedaled. "Oh no, I'm sure I just misplaced it," she said quickly, too quickly. Not a big deal, but the seed had been planted, and this time it had landed on dry, skeptical ground. That evening, as Ruth was emptying trash in the staff corridor, Mr. Collins stopped her near the literature office. His face was somber. "You're doing something important," he said quietly. She looked up at him, startled. "Excuse me?" "You didn't hear it from me," he said. "But I think something's coming, bigger than they know." She nodded. They didn't speak again. Later that night, she opened her inbox to find an email from the board's internal liaison. The subject line read, "Received and in review." The message was brief. "We've initiated the second phase. Anonymous interviews and audits will begin next week. You've done exactly what we hoped. Stay steady, it's almost time." She sat with the email open, heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't pride she felt. It wasn't even vindication. It was a fierce, aching clarity. They were finally going to see the rot. Not in the walls or the pipes, but in the air, in the unspoken rules, the winked-away comments, the hierarchy disguised as heritage, the system that praised charm but punished authenticity, that called itself merit-based while quietly bowing to donation checks and legacy status. She walked through the school the next day with the same cart, the same uniform. But something had changed. She was no longer just observing. She was witnessing the beginning of the end. Charlotte and Madison still strutted, still smirked, but their confidence had grown performative. Ruth could see it in the way they whispered less, how they checked over their shoulders after every cruel comment. The walls were no longer theirs. And still, Ruth said nothing. She let the silence grow. She let it stretch long enough for discomfort to bloom, because the fire had been burning for a long time, and now it was finally rising to the surface. The morning of graduation began like a painting too bright for the moment it would eventually frame. The skies over San Francisco were clear, no fog, no shadows, only a vast stretch of impossible blue. It felt ironic to Ruth Bennett, this perfect weather, as if the city itself was oblivious to what was about to unfold at Wellington Heights Academy. The courtyard shimmered with activity. Parents in designer sunglasses clutched camera phones and floral arrangements. Students adjusted caps, silk stoles, and pearl-studded gowns. Staff buzzed around like bees in controlled chaos, herding students into rows and reminding them where to sit, when to smile, when to move. Charlotte Devereaux stood near the senior archway, her champagne-colored graduation stole catching the morning sun like a spotlight. She laughed easily, head tilted just enough for the cameras, eyes gleaming with the certainty of being seen. Madison Langford was beside her hair professionally styled since dawn, makeup perfectly balanced to last all day under heat and attention. Their gowns were tailored, their shoes Louboutin, their postures sculpted by years of understanding power not as something earned, but as something inherited. They were poised to be remembered. And Ruth, she stood backstage, in a plain black robe, no cords, no medal, no embellishments. She had turned down the academic honors offered to her, declined the valedictory sash. Her presence alone would be loud enough. Her heart wasn't racing, not exactly. It pulsed with a calm that came only when fear had already been exhausted. She had written, rewritten, and folded her speech at least a dozen times. In the end, she chose her voice over the words. She needed no script to speak truth. Dr. Hassan, the Dean of Academic Affairs, approached her with a soft smile. He held a rolled program in one hand, his clipboard in the other. "You ready, Miss Bennett?" She met his eyes and replied, "I've been ready." He nodded, then turned and walked toward the stage. The ceremony began like any other, a string quartet playing a gentle rendition of Clair de Lune. Faculty filed in, followed by the students in their formal procession. Rows of chairs stretched beneath a white canopy on the academy's main lawn. The entire campus had been transformed into something glossy and grand, almost theatrical. It was everything Wellington Heights prided itself on: precision, poise, and the illusion of perfection. The speeches began. The student body president, the valedictorian as listed in the official program, though only nominally so, delivered a glowing reflection of their years together, filled with inside jokes, teacher shout-outs, and metaphors about future journeys. Madison grinned. Charlotte waved once toward the bleachers, where a drone hovered, filming. But beneath that glittering surface, tension was beginning to pull. A few parents had already heard the whispers of policy changes coming, of an anonymous investigation, of disciplinary hearings scheduled during the summer break. The students didn't know the details yet, but some had noticed the sudden quietness among faculty. They felt the shift like weather, subtle but undeniable. And then Dr. Hassan returned to the microphone. "Before we conclude this year's commencement," he said, clearing his throat, "we have one final recognition, one that by design has been kept confidential until this very moment." Chairs creaked, heads tilted. A wave of confusion passed over the audience. "This year," he continued, We piloted a program that allowed working members of our staff to pursue academic degrees through our partner university. The criteria for this initiative were strict: academic excellence, professional integrity, and anonymity throughout the duration of study. Now Charlotte sat up straighter. Madison frowned slightly. The crowd was suddenly alert. "It is my honor to announce," Dr. Hassan said slowly, "that the highest academic distinction this year, our true valedictorian, is someone you've passed in the halls every day, someone whose contributions you may not have fully seen. Please join me in recognizing Miss Ruth Bennett." The silence hit like a falling stone. There was no polite applause, just shock, raw and paralyzing. Madison blinked in disbelief. Charlotte stared forward, mouth parted slightly. Someone dropped a phone. A cough echoed from the back row, and then Ruth stepped out from behind the curtain. She walked slowly, calmly, her black robe hanging simply at her sides. No fanfare, no escort. Only a quiet, steady presence that moved toward the podium with grace far beyond the ceremony's script. She didn't look at the audience until she reached the microphone. Then she lifted her gaze and scanned the sea of faces. She saw Mr. Collins in the front row, hands folded, eyes shining with a kind of silent pride. She saw Dr. Hassan standing off to the side, jaw tense. She saw parents gripping programs like lifelines. And then her eyes settled on Charlotte and Madison, sitting 2 rows from the front. They did not smile. Ruth spoke. "I came to this school with a mop in one hand," she said, "and a question in my heart." The microphone picked up every word, crisp and clear. "I wanted to know what kind of place this really was. Beneath the rankings, beneath the brochures, beneath the marketing language about excellence and diversity. I wanted to know if dignity could be found here, or if it only lived in certain names." The audience was silent. "I was hired as a janitor. That's the role I accepted. But I was also asked to observe, not from a corner office or a boardroom, but from the ground, from the hallways, the bathrooms, the late-night classrooms where students speak freely because they think no one is listening." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I listened. Somewhere near the back, someone whispered, "Oh my God." "I witnessed small things," Ruth continued, "but small things add up. The way certain students were treated, the way certain students were allowed to treat others. I saw how silence became complicity, how cruelty became habit, and I wrote it all down." Now there was movement in the crowd. Parents glanced at each other. Some faculty looked down at their shoes. "The worst part?" she asked. "It wasn't hidden. It was public. It was normalized. And often, it was rewarded." She let that sit for a moment. "I am not here to shame anyone," she said softly. "I'm here to tell the truth, because the truth is what we owe each other, especially in places that claim to be shaping future leaders." Charlotte's jaw was tight. Madison looked pale. "I once had a daughter," Ruth said. "Her name was Alyssa. She would have been your age today. She never got to walk a stage like this. She never got the chance to hear her name called. I don't share that for sympathy. I share it because when I walk these halls, I see what she might have become, and I wonder, if she had come here, would she have been mocked too?" Now the silence had weight. It pressed against the chest. "I submitted my final report to the board last week. Based on my findings, the scholarship program is being restructured to prioritize integrity and contribution, not legacy. A full audit of disciplinary decisions over the last 5 years is underway. Students who participated in harassment, including verbal and social, will face formal review." Gasps moved like wind through the crowd. "This isn't revenge," Ruth said. "This is accountability, and accountability doesn't care how wealthy your father is." She stepped back. A beat of silence, and then a single clap. "Mr. Collins," then another, and then more. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't unanimous. But it was enough. Ruth walked back to her seat, not at the edge, not behind the faculty, but in the front row beside the trustees, no longer hidden, no longer silent. Charlotte did not applaud. Madison stared at her program with glassy eyes. Their world had cracked, just enough to let the truth through, and it was only the beginning. The applause faded slowly, like a tide receding from a storm shore. It didn't end in triumph, nor collapse into silence. It lingered, tentative, uneasy. As people looked around the outdoor stage at Wellington Heights Academy, their clapping hands slowed not from satisfaction, but from discomfort, from the weight of recognition settling over the polished lawn and curated ceremony. Ruth Bennett sat with her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her eyes forward. There was no smile on her face, only stillness, the kind that comes after a long, hard truth is finally spoken aloud. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't pointed fingers. But she had broken something wide open, and everyone knew it. Charlotte Devereaux was no longer sitting tall. Her shoulders had slumped, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of her chair, knuckles pale. Madison Langford sat beside her, eyes fixed on the grass. For once, neither of them whispered. There was no confetti, no final flourish. The ceremony closed with a few hurried words from Dr. Hassan, whose hands trembled slightly as he thanked families for attending. The string quartet began playing again, but the notes felt hollow, like someone had drained the music of its celebration. The crowd broke apart in waves. Some parents clapped Ruth on the shoulder as they passed, offering sheepish smiles they weren't sure how to wear. Others kept their distance, ushering their children quickly toward the parking lot. A few whispered questions into phones, likely trustees or attorneys. But no one spoke to Charlotte and Madison. Their parents waited at a distance. Charlotte's father stood by the car, his expression unreadable. Madison's mother paced near the valet, arms crossed tightly, eyes scanning for someone to blame. Ruth stayed seated until the last student had crossed the lawn. When she finally stood, the sun had shifted, casting long shadows behind the rows of now empty chairs. She didn't feel victorious. What she felt was release. Later that afternoon, Ruth returned to her apartment, just a small studio near Mission District. On the chipped kitchen table sat the commencement program, folded once, clean. She placed it down beside her unopened lunch container, sat in the single chair by the window, and stared outside where traffic moved like breath. Her phone buzzed. It was an email. Subject line: Board response. Immediate action plan. She opened it slowly, almost reverently. Ruth, your final report has been reviewed. Policy revision meetings begin Monday. Your courage will help reshape this institution. The board would like to extend an offer, Director of Equity and Student Well-being for the district. You don't have to decide today, but we believe your leadership is needed. Thank you. She closed her eyes. It wasn't pride that filled her chest, not triumph. It was something softer, a quiet, earned peace. Across the city, in homes far wealthier than her own, the story of the graduation had already begun to spread. A teacher's assistant had posted a blurry video of Ruth's speech on a private alumni forum. Within an hour, it had made its way to social media. The title read, "The Janitor Who Wasn't, Wellington Heights Graduation Shock." The comments came fast. I was at that ceremony. She brought the place to its knees. That woman is a genius, and she was right about everything. This is what accountability looks like. The story was no longer just hers. Back at the school, consequences were already taking shape. Charlotte Devereaux was summoned for a disciplinary review the following week. Her parents had no choice but to comply. The planned internship at her father's tech firm was quietly withdrawn. The board mandated that Charlotte complete 60 hours of supervised community service before her diploma would be officially released. She didn't return to campus. Madison Langford's parents threatened legal action. They demanded an apology. They denied every accusation. But the school, now bolstered by Ruth's thorough documentation, complete with timestamps, anonymous witness testimony, and corroborating behavioral data, stood firm. The board released excerpts from Ruth's findings to protect the integrity of the process. The Langfords backed down. Madison was allowed to graduate, but her honors distinctions were stripped, her name removed from the wall of academic excellence in the main hallway. Neither girl spoke publicly, but the ripple was felt. Faculty meetings began with new tones. Policies once left to interpretation were rewritten in bold. New staff were trained in bias intervention. Students, once emboldened by legacy, were reminded through action that silence was no longer protection. A week later, Ruth returned to Wellington Heights, not in uniform, but in a navy blue blazer and soft leather flats. Her ID badge now read District Leadership Director. She walked the halls she once polished, past the lockers where she had been mocked, past the trophy cases she had once wiped while others pretended she didn't exist. On the janitor's closet door, she left a single yellow sticky note. Respect isn't owed, it's revealed. RB. And just like that, she let the mop go. That morning, she stepped into the staff orientation auditorium as a guest speaker. The new hires, teachers, administrators, aides, sat quietly, some already recognizing her from the video. She didn't acknowledge the attention. She stood behind the podium, adjusted the mic, and began. "You may be wondering how someone like me ended up in a place like this," she said. "And the answer is simple. I never left." She let the quiet settle. Your job title doesn't determine your influence. How you treat the person you think you'll never need, that's what defines you. There were no long metaphors, no education jargon. She spoke plainly, like someone who had earned the right to. She ended with a reminder. Don't assume silence means ignorance. Don't mistake humility for weakness. And never, ever forget, some of the most powerful people you'll meet in life are the ones the world never taught you to see. She stepped down, and this time, when they applauded, it was full. Not out of obligation, not from performance, but from something deeper. Respect, not for what she said, but for what she had lived. Outside, as the fog rolled back in over the bay and the winds picked up from the ocean, Ruth walked alone toward her car. She paused just once, turning back to look at the school that had once overlooked her. She didn't smile, she didn't wave, she simply nodded, once, to the building, to the past, to the girl she used to be. Then she opened the door, sat down, and drove forward into something new. Not because she needed to prove anything, but because she no longer needed to stay hidden, and the world, whether it was ready or not, had finally learned how to see her. In a world built on appearances, where power is often mistaken for noise and worth is too frequently measured by wealth, Ruth Bennett's story reminds us that sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one that chooses to remain silent until the moment silence no longer serves justice. She walked into Wellington Heights Academy not with ambition, but with a quiet mission. On paper, she was just a janitor. She wore the uniform, pushed the cart, polished the trophies that bore names of families who believed their legacy came with immunity. To the students and staff who barely glanced at her, Ruth was a fixture, background scenery in a world of curated excellence. But Ruth was more than her title. Beneath her composed demeanor was a brilliant mind, a grieving mother, and a former academic whose life had once been structured by lesson plans, teacher evaluations, and curriculum design. A woman who had lost everything, her husband, her daughter, her career, and chose not to collapse under grief, but to redirect it towards something greater. She arrived at Wellington Heights under the weight of personal tragedy, yet with purpose stitched into every step. Recruited by a university-led educational equity initiative, Ruth was planted not to expose for the sake of scandal, but to observe, to understand, and ultimately to challenge a system from the inside out. She would be invisible, but she would not be absent. For 2 years, Ruth did what few are willing to do. She watched. She listened. She endured mockery from students like Charlotte Devereaux and Madison Langford, whose cruelty came laced in designer perfume and veiled in the language of privilege. They called her names. They laughed at her presence in classrooms after hours. They made jokes about her reading books, about her intelligence, about the very idea that someone like her could be anything more than a cleaner. But Ruth didn't retaliate. She recorded. She documented not just what was said, but what was unsaid. The glances, the exclusions, the way silence from authority figures allowed disrespect to take root. Every comment, every whisper, every moment of unkindness added fuel to a report that would eventually crack the polished surface of Wellington Heights. Still, Ruth was not motivated by revenge. Her silence was not submission, it was strategy. She understood that her real power came from remaining still long enough to reflect back the truth. Because Ruth wasn't just taking notes, she was holding up a mirror to a place that desperately needed to see itself. Behind the scenes, she was earning a degree in educational leadership, completing coursework in an unused classroom by night. She wasn't only studying theory, she was living its harshest applications. And when the time came, she stood before the very students and faculty who had once dismissed her, revealing herself not only as their top graduate, but as the architect of the investigation that would reshape the culture of their elite institution. Her speech at graduation was not a declaration of superiority. It was a reckoning. She exposed the normalization of cruelty, the dangers of unchecked privilege, and the painful truth that dignity in some spaces is only afforded to those who can afford it. She reminded everyone that behind every job title, every uniform, there is a story, a life, a lesson. And she didn't just speak that truth, she lived it. The aftermath was swift and necessary. Charlotte and Madison, once untouchable, faced accountability for their actions. The board, backed by Ruth's meticulous documentation, overhauled policies and introduced reforms to ensure that justice was no longer optional but institutional. The faculty re-examined their roles not just as educators but as moral stewards. Ruth was offered a leadership position, Director of Equity and Student Well-being, for the district, a role that reflected not just her credentials but her courage. She accepted, not to wear a crown but to build a bridge. She left her mop behind, not in bitterness, but in evolution. Her final note on the janitor's closet door read, "Respect isn't owed, it's revealed." And through her journey, she revealed what true leadership looks like. But perhaps the most powerful element of Ruth Bennett's story is that it could have ended differently. She could have chosen bitterness. She could have walked away. She could have let her grief swallow her, as the world so often does to women who've lost everything and have nothing left but their silence. But instead, she rebuilt, quietly, deliberately, unapologetically. So what can we learn from Ruth? First, we must understand that appearances lie, that the janitor you pass in the hallway might have more wisdom than your professor. That humility is not weakness, it is armor. And silence, when paired with clarity and purpose, is one of the most powerful tools of transformation. Second, we must confront the systems we benefit from, even unconsciously. Institutions that reward legacy over effort, charm over character, reputation over integrity, cannot serve as spaces for true growth. Change begins not with grand gestures, but with listening, with empathy, with discomfort. Ruth's journey teaches us that integrity is often invisible, that justice is rarely loud at first, and that the most lasting change doesn't start from the top. It starts with the overlooked, the underestimated, the quiet observers who see what others ignore and choose to act anyway. In today's world, where social media encourages constant performance, where people are valued for how visible they are rather than how honest they are, Ruth's story is a reminder that depth still matters, that substance still has a place. That being seen isn't about likes or views, but about being heard, felt, and remembered. So wherever you are in life, whether you feel dismissed, unseen, unheard, know this: your value does not diminish just because others fail to recognize it. You do not need permission to grow, you do not need validation to learn, and you certainly do not need applause to speak truth. Maybe you're someone working in a role where you feel invisible. Maybe you've been underestimated because of your background, your accent, your gender, your skin, your silence. Maybe you've told yourself you'll never be able to change anything because the system is too big. But change does not always require disruption. Sometimes it requires endurance. Sometimes it requires one person with a notebook, a memory, and a mission. So the next time you feel unseen, remember Ruth. Remember that she built her comeback not in a spotlight but in shadows. That she rose not by shouting over others, but by listening so deeply that her truth couldn't be ignored when she finally spoke. We need more Ruth Bennetts in the world, not because they expose the bad, but because they remind us what good should look like. Their stories push us to do better, to see deeper, and to live with more intention. And that's why we tell these stories here, because you deserve to hear them, because someone out there, right now, is Ruth. And maybe that someone is you. If this story moved you, if you saw yourself in Ruth or someone you know, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, talk about it. Let it be a conversation starter at work, at school, at your dinner table. Let it challenge the way we treat each other in spaces of power. And most importantly, if you want to continue supporting powerful, real, human stories like this, stories of dignity, resilience, truth, and transformation, please subscribe to this channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep digging deeper, to keep amplifying voices that deserve to be heard, and to keep reminding the world that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who changes everything.